Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 27th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined once again, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Welcome back. I know you weren't here last week, but welcome back to the cave, my friend.
Yes, I'm back, and hopefully you had a great conversation about Final Fantasy XIV. That was definitely not in my wheelhouse, so I'm glad you had an awesome guest for that show. But I'm here. I'm ready to talk about some Advance Wars.
Yeah, I mean, you returned at the perfect time because I know Advance Wars is a series you really love, and I'm excited to talk to you about it as well. But before we do that, as always, we got to clear the dungeon of the trash mobs, the pesky mobs, as you will. So if you like what we do and you want to support the show, there's a number of ways to do that. Number one, you can follow us on your podcast service of choice. We're on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're on all the places you find podcasts, so check us out there. Also, if you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, we will read it on the show. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every single Saturday morning where we put up a video version of the show, head over to YouTube, youtube.com/YumiCapri. Of course, like, comment, subscribe, all the things that people over on YouTube tell you to do. And then last but not least, if you want to throw a little tip in the old tip jar, get this show a little bit early, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/YumiCapri is how you do that. You get early access to this show, as well as some exclusive shows like the Yumi Capri podcast and the Pants Patreon podcast for Patrons podcast. All right, Garret, it's time to read from the sacred text so we can talk about this really cool series that we actually talked about a little bit back on the Fire Emblem episode. So this is kind of like almost like a part 2 to that episode in a lot of ways, because we're talking about Advance Wars today. Of course, this comes to us from Intelligent Systems once again. So as always, we start off every show with the fun facts. So let me go through some of these with you real quick. So currently, at the time of this recording, there are currently 12 games in the Advance War series, or just the War series in general, because the Advance War moniker didn't really start until the GBA days. So we're going to talk about the series just as a whole, even going back to its earliest days. So the very first game in the series debuted in Japan with Famicom Wars all the way back on August 12th, 1988 on the original Famicom. So this series is super old, Garret, believe it or not. Again, it was one of Intelligent Systems' first games that they worked on their own, because they've been in a support studio for years for Nintendo games, and it just happened to be that when they wanted to do their own game, they went and did this strategy game, which has a lot in common more with Advance Wars 2 on Game Boy Advance, and we'll talk about more of that, some of those similarities when we get to kind of the game mechanics. But it started mostly as just a real-time strategy game on your Famicom, which is just crazy to think about, because for the most part, we didn't really see like games like that on NES besides Famicom Wars, especially not in the US. Like, this was a Japan-only series. Then this was followed up with four Game Boy titles, starting with Game Boy Wars releasing in Japan on May 21st, 1991. And then they kind of, throughout the life of the Game Boy, they had like a new game like every 2 years, essentially, in Japan only. And then there was also a Super Famicom title called Super Famicom Wars, which released in Japan on May 1st, 1998. But when it was time to launch the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo decided to actually bring the series outside of Japan, because again, this series up until now in Japan only the entire way. However, when they decided to bring the series out of Japan, they didn't want to bring it outside of Japan as is, because they wanted to change the target audience for the game. So basically in Japan with the original games, if you look at kind of the box art for some of those games, or kind of the looks for them, they're like more like straight military kind of looks with a little bit of an anime style, but they're not really like bright and cheerful and colorful in the way that the Advance Wars games are. So they wanted, and that's in part due to Nintendo wanting the series to appeal to children as opposed to just teens, because essentially teen boys were the people buying the war games over in Japan, and they wanted it to appeal to more and more people. So with Advance Wars, they basically had the Intelligent Systems create a whole set of characters that the game kind of follows with like bright and cheery colors and kind of looks to them, so that again it appeals more to a mass audience. So Advance Wars was planned to be a GBA launch title when the GBA was coming out in 2001, but it actually missed the launch date, and it actually came out later that year on September 10th, 2001, which is an important date because the game was actually supposed to release pretty quickly after that in Japan and Europe, but it ended up getting delayed for a long period of time because September 11th was the next day after the North American release.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, you didn't like a lot of war games or games with guns like this were delayed out of that window out of respect for September 11th.
Yeah.
So the game itself came out in Europe the next year, but then in Japan, oddly enough, for a series that was Japan only for the longest time, didn't actually come out until 2004 as part of like a double pack with Advance Wars 2. Essentially, that's kind of how they did that in Japan. But that was the only way to buy the game in Japan, was in that double pack, essentially, which is just funny because now we actually have a double pack of those games coming out, soon. And then we got to talk about this offshoot a little bit because the series made a brief stint on home consoles in the form of Battalion Wars on September 19th, 2005 on the GameCube. They basically changed up their perspective when they moved to consoles by not doing like a top-down strategy game, and they moved it to like a third-person game that allowed you to basically build vehicles and facilities and stuff like that, kind of like the Advance Wars games, which was interesting. And again, there just weren't many games like that. And then it actually had a sequel that released on the Wii in 2007. And then last but not least for the fun facts, the final entry in the series came in the form of Advance Wars Day of Ruin on the DS on November 21st, 2008. And again, oddly enough, for a series that started as Japan only, the Japanese version of this game did not arrive until October 30th, 2013 on the 3DS. What? And the best part about this, Garrett, you couldn't buy this game normally. It was a Club Nintendo reward for Japan.
Of course it is.
If you were a platinum status member with Club Nintendo, you got the game for free, essentially. But otherwise, you couldn't buy it.
That's so ridiculous.
I know. It's just funny to think about because, again, like the series had with Advance Wars, the first one on Game Boy Advance, it sold way better in North America than it did in Japan. So it really skewed the series to become like a North American first franchise, which then just led it to, not release simultaneously in Japan. We talked about that with just Advance Wars itself not coming out until the double pack came out, and then the final game even just not coming out for 5 years later on a completely different platform that you couldn't even buy normally. So there you go. So those are all for the fun facts with Advance Wars. That's your rundown on the series. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, of course, that we have Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp coming out soon. Yep. Because that was actually supposed to come out at the time we're hearing this episode, but it obviously got delayed until sometime early next year.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
I need to catch up on my games, so.
Well, it was supposed to come out the same day as Halo and Dying Light 2 and Final Fantasy 14 Endwalker, so probably would have been the one game that would have been left behind. Anyways, at least by a lot of people. So there you go. So there's your history. But Garrett, now that we've talked about the history of the series, we got to talk about our history with Advance Wars. So start us off. Where did you start with the series?
So I did not realize how many other Wars franchise games there were other than Advance Wars. So you're enlightening me on the previous history. Advance Wars is probably a bigger gap than you may realize in my RPG history. I played a little bit, but not on my DS itself. When I got the Retro Pocket 2 about a year ago, I was like, okay, Advance Wars is one of the first things I want to try out because I actually didn't get it in the GBA days. And I wish I did. I actually played a very similar game, Age of Empires, on the DS itself. And when I was looking at gameplay last year of Advance Wars, I'm like, that's Age of Empires on DS. Why didn't I play this? And so I actually played the first game I played last year on my Retro Pocket, more to test out the DS emulator than anything. But I tried out Advance Wars Dual Strike for a good while, maybe for I don't know, 7 or 8 hours. And then I kind of just dropped it. This past month, I picked up the original Advance Wars on the GBA on my Retro Pocket 2. And let me tell you, Ryan, I am swooned by this game. This game is calling my name. It is probably, this is the game that little Garrett should have played back, 10 or 15 years ago, because I would be obsessed. Other than Pokemon, I would probably be obsessed with this series as I was with Age of Empires on DS. But yeah, I'm having a good time with it. I'm only playing it while I'm like on the bus, and it's great on the go. Retro Pocket too. I don't know, for people that don't know, it's an emulation machine on Android, runs on Android. I'm playing on RetroArch, and it's fantastic. Of course, I'll get the advanced 1+2 reboot when it comes out next year, but it still holds up very much today. The first Advance Wars. So, but that's very short history of mine. I'm completely into it, and I'll for sure probably beat the game, and I'll probably go on the Switch and play it more. But that's pretty much what I got. What about you, Ryan?
Nice. So yeah, it's for me, like I started on the Game Boy Advance because I had heard really good things about Advance Wars, because it actually got like a lot of really positive reviews when it came out. So I hadn't really heard too much about it beforehand, but I decided to pick it up pretty early and played it. And yeah, just like you said, like I really got obsessed with it. Like I really enjoyed my time with it. I really liked strategy games at the time. So I was definitely looking for more strategy games to play. And it was definitely like the perfect game to kind of bring on the road with me, especially because I used to travel on the bus a lot to go to work at the time, like as I was working at like Subway at the time. So I would be playing while I was on the job, while also on my way there, and just having a great time with it. And yeah, I really love the first game. As far as when it came around, when the sequel came around, I never jumped into it at the time when it first came out. But I did play many years later on Wii U, because eventually on Wii U, we got Game Boy Advance games on Virtual Console. So that's where I actually ended up picking up those games again, because I did eventually sell my Advance Wars copy, of course, because I was a dummy.
Oh,
I'm going to cough for 1 second.
Go for it.
There we go. So yeah, I was a dummy, sold my copy of Advance Wars, just like all my other GBA games, and it just makes, older Ryan really sad that I did that, because the only one I kept actually was Metroid Zero Mission, which I'm glad I did keep all these years later. But I actually had a pretty good collection of Game Boy Advance games, and I had the Fire Emblem games. I had those. I had a bunch of other like rarer ones nowadays that are more expensive. So like Advance Wars now, if you want to pick up the Game Boy Advance versions, they're pretty expensive. And then when it came time for the DS ones, I wasn't really playing a lot of DS at the time, because I was mostly into the PSP. Because I actually loved a lot of the RPGs that were on PSP, so that was just more of my system at the time. So I never really got a chance to play any of them, because I actually bought Advance Wars First Strike on DS, or Dual Strike, but then I never actually went around to playing it. So it's been sitting on my Wii U pretty much ever since I picked it up, and just I've never played it. So yeah, that's kind of my history with the series. I did go back and play some of those games again in preparation for the show. I have also dabbled with the Famicom and Game Boy titles, because there are fan translations for those out there. So there are ways to play them for sure, like maybe a Retroid Pocket 2 maybe. But
maybe
I like those games as well, but they kind of are a little more hardcore, I think, than some of the Advance Wars titles. They're a little more difficult, and not in a good way in a lot of ways. So I haven't really dove too far into those, but I've dabbled with them, and they're pretty cool as well. So if you definitely like the Advance Wars games, I would recommend, if you have the means to go back and check those out, definitely try them out. Also, I should mention Battalion Wars. I did play that on GameCube as well.
Oh, you did, yeah.
Which it sounded like a great idea on paper, but the execution was not really there for that game. Like, it didn't really play super well.
Okay.
It was kind of clunky to control, especially like the shooting elements weren't really good. Like the strategy elements were pretty solid as far as ordering your troops around, or ordering specific tanks and other vehicles and other troops to call in to help you defeat the enemy. But all the shooting mechanics kind of made the game a little more frustrating than it should have been, which kind of led to it being a little disappointing for me, which is why I never really checked out the Wii version of the game at all. So
okay,
there you go. But yeah, I'm also very excited for Reboot Camp 1 and 2. I think those games look awesome. So I'm hoping they're awesome as well, because the first two Advance Wars games are really fun. So there you go. But let's talk about the story of Advance Wars. And I chuckle, Garrett, because these games don't really have much story to them, really. It's
not much of a story to it. No.
It's really the story of the blue team for the red team, and then you pretty much call it a day.
Orange team. The Orange Star Army and the Blue Star Army, or something like that. A Blue Moon, sorry. army.
Well, in some of the games, they're the Red Star.
Some of the games, they're the Red Star too?
Yeah, so
Okay.
it just depends on what game you're playing. But yeah, for the most part, yeah, that's pretty much all you need to do about the story. There is, in Advance Wars 2, there's like a campaign mode with a story to it, and I believe the last game in the series, Days of Ruin, I think has a story mode as well. But
I heard it's pretty good too. Like
Yeah.
that one seems to be like a critical darling. The last Advance Wars, Days of Ruin. I still see a lot of them on eBay, like on sale, and it's quite popular.
nice. Yeah, I mean, I've never really played it, and I don't really know too much about that one. So hopefully the story's good. But the story in Advance Wars 2, it's not great. It exists. It's there as a vehicle just to kind of get you through specific missions. But for the most part, again, this isn't really a story-based series, but I had to throw it on the document. Garrett, it's something we talk about because I think it's important for people who are kind of new to the series to kind of know going into it that, like, don't come into it expecting a story like Fire Emblem or something like that, like, or other Intelligent Systems titles, because story is not really a big focus, I think, for these games.
Yeah, this is hard to say. Define this game or these sets of games as RPGs is kind of pushing it because it really doesn't have a story. The characters are there, the commanders are there, but like, I don't know. It seems more like it's turn-based strategy. Like that's the top like defining of this genre of games. And RPG, you could say, yeah, it's an RPG, but it is turn-based strategy first and foremost. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's got like light RPG elements, but it's not like a full, it's not as far in the RPG direction as something like Fire Emblem is. So just keep that in mind kind of going into it. So, but I wanted to bring that up. And also, speaking of where people should start, real quick, kind of omitting the remake that's coming, because we know that that's coming on Switch, but that's like really far away. If someone wanted to get into the series now, Garrett, where would you recommend someone start with the series?
That's a good question because it's very hard to find these games, really. If you can get yourself a copy or a digital, like on Wii U, can you get Advance Wars 1 on GBA,
you can get
right?
Advance Wars 1,
Okay.
2, and Dual Strike. The only one that's missing is Days of Ruin.
Okay, I would definitely start there. If you guys got a Wii U, that's probably a perfect way to go. And if you have the means of a GBA, or maybe an emulator, I'm not sure. You can start off over there with Advance Wars. I think the first Advance Wars still hold up to this day. And it's, we'll talk more about the mechanics later, but I definitely recommend Advance Wars 1.
Yeah, actually, I would also recommend Advance Wars 1 to start as well. Like, and it's not even just one of those things where I think you should play them in sequential order. I think that it's actually the simplest and easiest one to wrap your head around. Especially the only downside is there's no real campaign. It's mostly you're playing like versus battles versus the computer.
Yes.
Because you're meant to basically play it with another person in like System Link who also has the game. That's kind of the way that game was designed. But obviously, if you've got a Wii U, for example, you can't do that. But actually, like, again, playing those games on Wii U, the emulation for Virtual Console on Wii U games was like notorious for a lot of consoles, but the one system that they totally nailed was GBA. Like the GBA games that are on there are actually really fantastic ports of those games. Whether you're looking at something like Metroid Fusion or Golden Sun or Advance Wars, like I think it's actually a really great console for that. So plus they're super cheap. They're like $8 Canadian to pick up the like each of the first two games, and then the DS games are like $10 Canadian. So I actually think that Wii U is probably, if you've got a Wii U, that's the place to check them out. Otherwise, again, it is a little bit harder to get the cartridges for GBA because they are expensive, especially if you're trying to not find like a bootleg version from China, essentially. So I would recommend at that point maybe going in the direction Garrett hinted at of like maybe a Retroid Pocket or something like that. But otherwise, if you got a Wii U, I'd say that's actually probably the best place because it's the cheapest place and they hold up really well there. So I would check them out on Virtual Console there. Otherwise, again, if you want to wait, just wait till April because I'm sure Reboot Camp's going to be awesome. But we can't really say that with confidence considering what just happened with Grand Theft Auto and the whole blow up with that. Like anything could happen between now and then, right? With
I don't think they're doing this weird AI upscaling of Advance Wars 1 and 2. It seems like they're fully just remaking the game from the ground up. Similar to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, they just shifted all the game and completely remade it in Unity. It's going to be the same thing here. It's going to be just on a updated engine. It's going to be the same exact game. It's just now with new cool 2D art.
Plus, it's being done by WayForward, and I actually trust that studio implicitly. Like, they are really awesome. So, but it's just one of those things where I'm trying to get myself out of the habit of just blindly recommending pre-ordering stuff after Grand Theft Auto or Cyberpunk. Like, it's like,
I agree with that.
Yeah, exactly. But let's dive deep into the mechanics of Advance Wars, Garrett, because this is kind of the meat and the potatoes that I know us dorks really want to talk about this stuff. So let's talk about the mechanics in Advance Wars and kind of how this works. So first off, depending on the game you're playing, it'll be a little more simple or a little more complicated. So we'll kind of talk about some of the baseline elements. For example, this is, as you kind of mentioned, it's a turn-based strategy game, similar to something like Civilization or like Age of Empires on the DS, where essentially you're controlling a bunch of troops, you're trying to kill a bunch of enemy troops, and you're basically trying to win the day. That's kind of the baseline for what this game actually is. So usually you move all your allies in turns, and then you're trying to explore the map because there's fog on the map. So there's like kind of the fog of war effect that you'd see in like real-time strategy games like StarCraft, for example. So you don't see all the enemy units from the very beginning, and then you kind of have to strategically move around the map to kind of find the enemy units. In Advance Wars 1, you actually don't build troops yourself on the map. You actually are given a set group of units to basically take out a set group of units. Whereas the other games in the series, going back to Famicom Wars, and then starting again with Advance Wars 2, you're basically building units from your command center for a certain dollar amount. And you're kind of making money as you go and explore more of the map and start taking down troops to build bigger and bigger things to basically, defeat your enemy with. So that the complexity of, managing units and whatnot is different from game to game. As well, you can also do what's called captaining your units, where essentially you can promote them to being like a commander or promote them different up levels as they take down enemy troops or as you kind of move them around the map as well. Garrett, what other mechanics am I kind of missing here as far as the combat are concerned?
Yeah, so Advance Wars 1 is very you got different types of units. It's very unit type dependent. Yeah. You got naval units, you got air units, and then infantry, and then tanks. And each of them have their pros and cons. And depending on the unit, and like, let's say a naval unit, it will be strong against, let's say, a tank or against a boat or a submarine. So you're really going to have to know how to place your units versus the other. It is like pretty much advanced chess, more or less. So and then there's a lot of units, let's say artillery, that can shoot long range but not close range at all. And so you're going to have to figure that out as you kind of go turn to turn and make sure your units are in a formation where you're defending your long range units and then keeping your infantry kind of like scattered around and stuff like that. So that's one thing is the unit type is very important. The other thing is the buildings. And so in Advance Wars 1, what you want to do is actually the main objective is either two things. You either kill all units or capture the enemy base. And so you can do that. You can try to go for the enemy base and destroy it or whatever. But there are buildings in between, left and right, where your soldiers, your infantry units can capture. And if you capture those buildings, you basically can be a base. And that base can be used for healing, for supplying ammunition. There's also an ammunition like stock in your tanks, in your naval units. You're going to have to figure that out too. There's also fuel, which was I found pretty interesting as well. So there's limited movements throughout the whole map. And then also basically you have to consider all of these things in general. I was in certain battles where I'm like, oh my gosh, my helicopter is about to run out of ammo or run out of fuel, and I have to bring them back. I have never seen any other strategy RPG that considers that minute detail, and it's kind of crazy to see a GBA game doing that in general. So that's basically the mechanics.
Yeah, they made it a little more simplistic, I think, in the first one, and then they just totally went all out with the second Advance Wars game, where they really started to reintroduce, make those elements matter so much more than in the first game. Whereas I felt like even though you had a lot of stuff to manage in the original Advance Wars, it was like so much more manageable. Like it was so easy, it's so much easier kind of to wrap your head around the idea to kind of make sure to take over buildings and stuff like that. Also, one of the things that we didn't mention as well is terrain. It plays a huge element in the gameplay as far as it's concerned, because if you're on a mountainside, or if you're in the forest, or if you're hidden behind some kind of cover, generally it's much harder for the enemies to actually hit you or take you out. So you just want to make sure to kind of strategically place your units around some kind of cover in some way, which I think is actually really intuitive, because it doesn't just impair movement in the way that a game like Fire Emblem does. It plays much more into the advantages and disadvantages that your troops kind of have, and some of the maps you play on, like the enemy where the enemy has the high ground to kind of start with, you're like at a disadvantage already when kind of the battle starts. But I like that dynamic and how you have to plan for that a little bit, but and not get like too crazy with your movements and whatnot. But with one of the things that I found while playing kind of the earlier Advance Wars games that I wish that they did a little bit better was giving you a preview of what your troops can actually attack when they're actually moving and then attacking, because unlike Fire Emblem, where once you move to an area, it'll actually show you the range of all the enemies you can kind of attack. It basically like gives you the fire option, and then when you press that option, it's like it just goes right into combat kind of. So I wish it gave you like more of a sense of like, here's the area where these troops kind of can aim from, especially when you're trying to move around like artillery and stuff like that, because you don't really have like a clear sense of like where the artillery can actually attack from, or like what units it can actually hit. It just gives you kind of a little bit of a percentage when you actually do the attack itself. But beyond that, you don't really have enough information, I find, which led me to kind of do a little more research outside the game itself to kind of figure a lot of that stuff out, rather than kind of experimenting it and then kind of get into kind of terrible situations. So, and I think that's something that they did better in the DS versions, but in the original JBA versions, and I think that goes all the way back to the older games back on the Famicom and the Game Boy. They're kind of like that too. So I wish that they were a little more user friendly. Maybe when with the Reboot Camp, maybe they're going to do something like that with it, hopefully. But we'll see.
I hope the one thing they got to do, I think, is like look at enemy movements and attacks and lock it. Like Fire Emblem, you can like make sure that you know where all the enemy units can go and where they can move and where they can attack. And a lot of times you can like lock it so you can see the whole thing while you move your units. Definitely not a thing in Advance Wars. You have to hold a button. You have to hold B on and highlight the unit itself. And it's like, okay, can it attack this unit? Okay, it kind of can't. And then as you said, Ryan, like you have to move your unit and you don't know if that can fire a certain unit from a certain range. You kind of have to actually know and like ingrain in your memory. Okay, it's like 4 tile spots away from the artillery unit itself. So
just like chess is like that. Like you got to go back to your chess point as well. So yeah, which I thought was like interesting. Also, I don't know if you knew this about the older titles, but when I talked about the fog and the fog of war being a part of the big part of the battle, the older games actually don't have fog of war. So you can actually see all the enemy units on some of the older titles. So but I actually kind of like the idea of having the fog of war there and not being able to see everything right away, because I like the idea of having to scout out some of the enemy troops a little bit better than just knowing kind of everything from the beginning. But that if you are going to go back and play some of those other titles, just be aware that that's a mechanic that's in those games that is kind of different from the Advance Wars titles. And then other than that, I'm trying to think of anything else that might be covered in mechanics, Garrett. I think we've got most of it.
I think one thing you've got to make sure while you play the game is like attacking first could be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how much health are you gonna actually put in damage into a unit. Because once you put damage into a unit, the health goes down, but also the attack goes down and the defense goes down. And so, but you don't know one advantage versus another. It's a lot of strategy behind that area too. Is like when to attack first or when to defend so your other units can attack. Kind of like decoy or luring enemy units in and stuff like that. So
yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the army system in Fire Emblem Three Houses, where like as it gets whittled down from health, because it's essentially not just one big health pool for your unit. It's essentially the number of guys that are all like
Yes.
all on one space essentially. So as it gets whittled down as it gets attacked, which I think it's a cool mechanic. I kind of like that a little bit, but also like if you're a little too aggressive, for example, it can definitely put you in a precarious situation if you're not careful with it or if you don't know what you're doing. So it can screw you a little bit if you're newer to the game or if you're not sure what to do with it. But
There's also support units that can help fuel your unit types or transport your infantry across the map, which it's actually pretty vital if you just want to get done with the game and go straight to the enemy base. You could just send like 2 troop units and just shoot all the way and just go for it if you want to try that strategy as well.
Yeah, and in Advanced Wars 1, regardless of what map you play, you always at least start with one of those, which is nice. And it kind of like, in a way, it makes like units like transports that you'd find in other real-time strategy games like StarCraft, for example, just so much more interesting and much more useful to have on the battlefield, because it not only does it transport your troops across the battlefield, but it also allows you to just resupply your troops so you're not, constantly running back to buildings and stuff like that. But it's also, that's like an element that you don't really have to worry about in a lot of other games. But I still like that it places so much more importance on those units versus in other like real-time strategy games where you're not even really thinking about, oh, I lost a troop transport, no big deal. That's not a big problem. Whereas in this, you're like hurting a little bit if you lose your transport. So you really have to make sure to kind of guard them carefully in this game. But otherwise, you've got your wider assortment of tanks and helicopters and ground units, both with machine guns and rocket launchers. And they all have, again, as you talked about, like kind of strengths and weaknesses. It's not like the weapon triangle from Fire Emblem. It's like each unit is like better or worse against specific units. So you kind of have
a little bit more granular for sure. Yeah.
And the game doesn't tell you that. So you kind of have to like figure it out on your own through trial and error in a lot of ways. Or I would just say for anyone who's new to the game, unless like Reboot Camp tells you this in the game itself, like don't be afraid to play with a guide, or like if you're going to play for the first time, don't be afraid to at least look at a guide if you don't want to figure all this out yourself. I think it's good to maybe look at kind of the strengths and weaknesses for certain troops. So you kind of go into it with a clearer mind, I think.
I would have to say the Advance Wars 1 field missions, probably the best tutorial I've ever seen in a strategy RPG type of game, turn-based strategy RPG, because they have 15 missions where it's like, all right, we're going to go through infantry. What's the strength and weakness of that? Okay, let's go through tanks. Let's go through like jets. Like they go through the whole gambit in that field mission. And actually it's a long time. I was quite surprised how long that tutorial was. So hopefully they'll just bring that back in Reboot Camp and everyone's up to speed. It's so funny because the dialogue kept saying, okay, make sure you press the R button so you can always go back to figure out what the information is. I feel like there was a lot of quality control testing, and it's like, okay, a lot of people play testing this and they have no clue what to do. Let's make sure they know press the R button to make sure that they know all the information kind of in front of you. So there you go. And
they do actually present the tutorial in like a really fun and kind of quirky way as well. So hats off to the localization team on that one, because I think that they actually hit it out of the park with that as well. So So and as far as the missions themselves, for the most part, you've got bigger maps and smaller maps, and they kind of just depend on what map you select from the beginning. But you have a wide variety of maps to kind of choose from, which is nice. And depending on the game itself, you have just a wider variety of maps. As you go through the series, like I know the DS ones in particular, you have a lot more map variety than the Game Boy Advance ones. Like the first 2 games, you have some variety, but for the most part, it's mostly like size variety. You're not really going to too many different locations. Like there are some different locations, but it's not like they're not wildly different or anything like that. Versus some of the DS games where I think vary a lot more anyways like that. But you can also play with friends, which is kind of cool. So if you've actually got 2 Game Boy Advance games, the versus mode is actually surprisingly fun as well. Like I think this is actually like a really good multiplayer RPG experience if you've got a friend and you have 2 GBAs and you want to try it. I actually think it's worth pursuing because I think it's actually pretty fun as well. So I definitely recommend playing the multiplayer as well. But for the most part, the multiplayer is pretty much everything we just talked about, but just playing it with another player, essentially, rather than playing against the computer. So that's that. But otherwise, I think we've covered off most of the mechanics in the game itself. So I kind of want to move on and talk about one subject that we need to talk about with a series like this, especially because it's been dormant for so long and it's finally getting a new entry. And that is, where do we want the series to go from here? Like, what do we want from the future of the series? Assuming, of course, Garret, if I assumed that you were Nintendo, and because as people do, people just assume you're Nintendo from time to time, and we gave you the green light to do another Advance Wars game, how would you want to proceed with it? Like, what would you like to see from it?
That's a very good question. First off, I just want hats off to this Nintendo making the correct decision to kind of outsource this type of franchise to another studio to work on it and to get warm with it, because I would like to see other studios have their own take on this genre. And hopefully with Advance Wars 1 and 2 reboot and see what that reception is, I hope they just do a direct sequel, call it Advance Wars 3. And just make it by WayForward or another studio and see what they come up with. What kind of new mechanics can they do? Can they just do more of the same, but like just improve upon it, innovate upon it more? I don't think there's a specific mechanic per se to like help the franchise, because I think they expanded all they can mechanic like in the mechanics zone, but I would just like to see, okay, from WayForward, what can you do on top of just Advance Wars 1 and 2? What's the next goal? What's the next step? You could do more narrative, you could do more story, you can have more like commander type of powers. That would be kind of cool to see. But yeah, other than that, I think Nintendo's making the right call here. You don't want this franchise, like I feel like it's just going to die in wither if it's tried to do anything else in its internal studios. They have plenty of other major franchises to work on. So it's great that they're outsourcing this and getting ideas from different people.
Yeah, and I've actually liked this approach with other Nintendo franchises as well, especially like Metroid is the one that comes to mind when we talk about this, because them taking a chance with Mercury's team to kind of remake kind of the Metroid franchise on their own, like has yielded great results, because Samus Returns was great, but then Dread is like a Game of the Year contender this year from Mercury's team, from a studio that like I never thought could ever make a Game of the Year caliber game, especially after some of the like Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2, for example. Like I thought like after that, like there was no coming back from that kind of thing. But no, they did an amazing job with it. So I would, and WayForward is a studio that I know does amazing work, and especially like you said, Garret, like maybe Intelligent Systems is kind of done with the series and doesn't really want to go back, or they felt like they've evolved it as much as they could. So I love just seeing, first of all, just the series itself getting new light with a remake, but then ultimately if they do it its own kind of entry from WayForward, I would love to just see WayForward, for example, just take the gloves off and get given like creative freedom to do whatever they want with it, because maybe they could do something crazy, like putting the game in space, for example, or they could do
that'd be cool.
Some other stuff. Maybe they make a medieval fantasy kind of Advance Wars game, or like take the series in a bunch of different directions. Like maybe since the mechanics are really fleshed out, maybe the setting is what needs to be, changed with the franchise, or maybe like I don't think the graphical style needs to be changed up too much, because I like kind of the graphical style of Advance Wars. I think it actually holds up very well, which is something we talked about many times with those games actually holding up today. Like the graphical style of Advance Wars, even with the DS titles, looks awesome today. So I don't think they need to change that too much, but maybe just the style, because then, for example, if they change up like the setting for Advance Wars, they can definitely change up maybe the vehicle or the troop design, and then they can balance them differently, and then that can really add breathe some new air into the franchise. In a lot of ways, kind of comparing it to kind of the evolution between, Warcraft and StarCraft. Like I think that's maybe the type of jump that this series kind of needs. And again, they don't need to go wild and crazy with it. Maybe even if it's just like more future techie versus like what's in Advance Wars. I think that's cool. Maybe I think that's maybe where I would like to see where the series goes, because then again, it just gives them more freedom to experiment with stuff. Because again, I think if they change the formula too much as far as keeping it in the same setting, it might upset some people, or it might change the balance in a way that like doesn't make the game a very fun playing experience. Because one of the things that I think makes the previous Advance Wars games so fun is the balance between all of the units. Because I think that Intelligent Systems totally nailed like how balanced all those troop types are.
Yeah.
So like tinkering with that too much, I think is a bad idea. Without again just doing a complete overhaul of the series or the series location. So that's kind of what I want to see with the series next. But all in all, I just want to see more entries in the series. I think it's an awesome series that I know a lot of people really missed out on the GBA or the DS. And again, with Reboot Camp coming to Switch, it gives many more people a chance to actually try this out for the first time. So I'm hoping people actually check out Reboot Camp, and I hope that it's awesome. And hopefully that means we get more of these games, because more than anything, Garrett.
Me too.
Regardless of what my ideas are for the series, I just want to see more of it at this point. Like, it's been dormant for like 13 years now. So I'm just ready for more Advance Wars at this point.
I also want them to just test out the level of just development of these games, because they don't need to be very huge in terms of development. Like Advance Wars 1 and 2 reboot, I understand. Give it $60 price tag. It's a 2-pack game, fully remade game. Makes sense to me. Okay, $60. Yeah, you got my money. But like with a new Advance Wars game, why don't you just try the $30 game? Why don't you try, like, don't make this a 30 or 40 hour experience. Make this to a 6 to an 8 hour experience, and then maybe add some like DLC levels on top of that, more online content. Because I think having these games, more bits and pieces of it versus these fully fleshed out games, I think that's good for the genre, because these games, they're meant to be like level based. Yeah. And like,
well, not only that, but if they put more into the online element, like I think that will really help the series give like the content get legs, where maybe you don't need to put out a large campaign for it. Maybe you do put out like a 6 to 8 hour campaign, and then people get their money's worth out of it by playing with their friends online. Like, I think that's more the direction they should really be going with it, for sure. Like, not necessarily make online the big focus, but at least like with the online elements now that you're not having to worry about, Game Boy Advance link cables or, connecting your DSs to each other. I really think that it could go a long way to kind of increasing the longevity of the game's life as well. Plus, that not every game should be $60, and this is the type of game that I think they could easily develop for $40, and then maybe not give it like the AAA budget, because I don't think this is a game that needs a AAA budget behind it. Like, because we've seen plenty of indie studios do fantastic games like this, like Wargroove, for example. So like, there are tons of games out there that are doing this already that don't need that budget or need to charge full price for it. So, I would be interested in seeing them explore the price range as well. But it's Nintendo. I mean, they don't really do that that often as well. Like, I really thought if they were going to do that ever, Garrett, I thought it was going to be with new Pokemon Snap, and that was a $60 game. So. Yeah,
and then even with WarioWare Get It Together, like it's a short game, it's a small game, and they knocked it down $10. But it doesn't seem like, if it's a Nintendo franchise, they're not gonna bog it down too much unless I feel like what's the Crypt of the Necrodancer, Cadence of Hyrule.
Oh, Cadence of Hyrule,
yeah, that was the one game that had a lower price, I think. But we'll see, I guess. Also, you said Wargroove. Yes, if you can't find a copy of Advance Wars, or you don't have a Wii U, that's fine. Wargroove is a very good alternative Advance War type of game.
Definitely. And I brought that up too, because we've talked about it on the show as well. Because it's almost like one of the ideas I kind of floated out there, like a fantasy version of Advance Wars. Like, it's kind of that idea. So, which is pretty cool. Which is why, like, I know like this style of game will work in other, settings and genres. It doesn't have to be just, modern military kind of thing. So there you go. Yeah. I think that's all for Advance Wars, a pretty awesome series, if I might say so myself. Although it's
really good.
definitely one of like the shortest series we've talked about on the show before, because I mean, it's not like a series with like 20 or 30 entries, or God forbid Pokemon 2 weeks ago where there were 86 games in the franchise. But a series definitely that I think has flown under a lot of people's radars for too long, Garrett. Like people need to start playing these games because they're really, really good. And I hope people definitely check out Reboot Camp, even if it's not good. I hope people at least, give it at least a
I
look.
think it's going to be base level like 7 out of 10.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I mean, you never know. It could get up to an 8, but it also could go down to a 6, but you never know.
That's true.
You never know. But before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me on Twitter at Bland Explosion, and you can see me over at the Nintendo Shack, part of the podcast video game podcast network, PSVG. Oh my gosh, I just messed that up. That's okay. You can see that over at Twitch on Thursday nights at twitch.tv/PSVG, and you can support them at patreon.com/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turnford. Oh my God, I screwed that up too. As for, you can also find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Yumi Capri, on Twitter at Yumi Caprice, and on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turnford. This has been episode 27 of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/Yumi Capri. And I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start with by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PM Entertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth, and our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support,